Mr. Kennedy, welcome. Dr. Gideon has been expecting you.
Funny. I don't remember getting an invitation.
Well, he's waiting for you.
Can't have that, can we?
If there were one philosophy to describe the development process of Requiem, it would be giving the players what they want. More than any of the other entries leading up to it, Requiem, or the game that would eventually become it, was shaped again and again by the responses of its surrounding releases. Even though Requiem was released as Resident Evil 9, its development kicked off alongside 8, shortly after the release of 7. With the early skepticism that surrounded the trailers leading up to RE7, Capcom was afraid of putting all its eggs in one basket. Instead of waiting to see how fans would respond, the team decided to split up into multiple projects to address what might go wrong. Potential complaints about the first-person camera would be met with the upcoming third-person remakes. And any issues with the dialed-up horror could be cleared up in the now-cancelled Hunk spin-off. Most interestingly though, Capcom also considered a fallback if fans found the game to be too linear. In what would have starred Leon and Jill, Resident Evil Apocalypse would have been the series' first ever online multiplayer experience. Thankfully though, that was pretty quickly put to rest, with the end of 2017 showing 7 as the best-selling RE game to date, only surpassed by the games that would eventually follow in its footsteps. While the exact point in development isn't clear, it was definitely sometime after seeing the success of 7 that Capcom thankfully decided to abandon their original direction for Apocalypse. Director Koshi Nakanishi, in retrospect about Apocalypse, decided to focus on what they thought the fans wanted, stating that Apocalypse wasn't what the fans wanted to see or play, an idea that Nakanishi and the team, for better or worse, would take to heart. Capcom's always had an aversion to alienating fans, and while in some ways that's definitely a good thing, it's also caused a lot of problems in keeping the franchise consistent. Upon seeing the success of 4, the first proper action game of the franchise, Capcom really lost sight of the series' trajectory. 5 would proceed to push the limits of action before 6 would eventually end up breaking them. Wanting to tie together all the prior games leading up to it, head director at the time, Eiichiro Sasaki, claimed that 6 would be the natural culmination of the series, a game that would do that by appealing to the existing fanbase but also the Call of Duty audience. The natural culmination of the series, he said. Needless to say, it was a questionable choice, and it led to yet another soft reboot of the franchise and the series' eventual first-person debut. Course directing from the failure of 6, Resident Evil 7 set the clear idea that the games needed to return to their roots. From now on, Koshi Nakanishi decided the games would once again become grounded, giving each entry a strong single location that players would have to brave through. There would be no returning hero protagonists, and there would be no crazy action. Well, until they decided to change their minds again. In some ways, the new first-person series of RE games have succeeded by trying to capture the series' highlights. 7 took inspiration from 1's mansion and horror tone, 8 took heavy influence from 4's village and action gameplay, and now 9 takes from 6 in that Capcom for this game once again decided, fuck it, let's try do everything. 9 tries to recapture the fans of 7's grounded survival horror, but also tries getting back the fans who missed the action era. Which is pretty interesting considering that 9 at another point in development was meant to focus purely on the survival horror side. Leon, as the sole protagonist, would have gone through his own RE7 style experience. It didn't take long though for the team to conclude that it wouldn't really make sense to put a veteran Leon into the same situation Ethan would be, claiming that a scared Leon would be something the players wouldn't want to see. Coming up with the idea of Grace, Capcom eventually settled on having 2 protagonists. They could keep Leon in the game, but also have Grace to give us the tense experience they originally planned on. The idea of 9 is clear. It's not just a game for some fans, but it's a game trying to be for every fan. A game for people who want survival horror, but also for those who want action combat. A game where you can play both in first person and third person. A game where it can feel new while also taking more than a few chances to retread. While I wouldn't say Capcom was trying to pander to everyone, looking at its development history, at the very least they were trying to avoid scaring anyone off. Ironic for a game that sells itself on horror. But if we're questioning whether or not Capcom succeeded in this, Well, we've got a little while longer to answer that. Opening up with Grace, we're sent to investigate the Redwood Hotel, something Grace is clearly uncomfortable with, but does reluctantly anyway. Where the last few games have been set either in the middle of nowhere or in completely overrun streets, even if it's only for a few minutes, it's nice getting the chance to see just a normal environment that hasn't gone to hell rendered in the RE engine. In a way, this whole opening section really reminds me of the intro to 7, where we have this deceptively calm walk up to the baker's estate. Like in that game, this whole section feels like it's mostly here for atmosphere and exposition, alongside some healthy foreshadowing for the game's later plot points. I think it's important to note that the game by default starts Grace off in first person, and for the most part it's probably best to keep it that way. While the third person perspective really shows off the game's graphics, Grace's sections are designed similarly to Ethan's. The atmosphere really relies on you being up close to the environmental design. This is especially the case with the flashback sequence we have with Grace, where we get to see exactly what happened to her and her mother in the hotel before the game starts. Although it works fine in third person, I think the dark hallways make the most sense in first. Sadly though, Alyssa's inclusion in this game is pretty much limited to this single section, with her untimely death being the conclusion of the sequence. While I get what they were going for here, it does feel a bit strange to have gone through the effort to redesign and bring her back just to kill her off after a minute of screen time. Although I haven't personally played Outbreak, I do feel for the few who might have been looking forward to some kind of connection to that game, because Capcom really doesn't seem to have had any intentions beyond just banking on nostalgia. As we cut back to the present, we get the game's first zombie encounter, having us immediately lose our gun before a quick chase sequence that ends in Gideon knocking us out. And that's it for the hotel. It's not inherently a complaint, but am I the only one that thought Redwood would take up a bigger part of the game based on the trailers? It takes up half of the first trailer, but is less than like 5% of the game's actual runtime. I don't hate it, but I would have much preferred if Capcom just committed to designing an actual section here. You get a gun and a few keys, but there's really nothing to do other than just walk in a straight line. There's no actual gameplay here, and it definitely shows on replays, where this section just really feels like a slog. Luckily though, the same can't be said for our first encounter as Leon. If the Redwood Hotel is like the opening to 7, the Redwood streets are more like the opening of 4. Or maybe 6 with how Leon fights through an infected city street. While it's not quite on the same level as the first village encounter, it's still a highlight to look forward to each time I start a playthrough, even if it ends a little too soon. We get the chance to play around with Leon's new axe, and it feels pretty good, unlike Leon with his new Raccoon City syndrome. I assume it's mostly here to lend some more stakes to Leon's sections, though it also creates a lot of intrigue for the rest of Requiem's plot. Why is the T-virus only taking effect now? How's Leon gonna get out of it? And most importantly, what's up with the other Raccoon City survivors? Most of the Outbreak cast is dead, but what about Claire, Jill, or Ada? What are they doing during this game? A whole lot of questions that I expected answers to at some point. Do we get any though? Let's check back on how Grace is doing. Oh. I think I can confidently say that the girl is probably the scariest stalker in the franchise so far. To me. While her presence might be less frequent than Mr. X or Jack, I think it might genuinely be the series' most impactful utilization of stealth. Continuing the trend of taking from RE7, this abandoned wing really feels like this game's equivalent of the guest house. It's a short and relatively linear location that forces us to work up the courage it'll take to get through the main area later on. But where Mia was mostly limited to scripted events, the girl still is. Although you can definitely use stealth, once she sees you, you basically have two options. Either run to the lights, or don't. Either way, the game's gonna give you something to run from. The downside though is that this section only really works the one time. I remember thinking with how prominent this stalker was in the ad material that they'd do something more interesting with her, especially with how much she looks and sounds like Lisa Trevor. Sadly though, I don't think she lives anywhere close to the mantle. While she comes back later, there's not really much room for any emergent gameplay here. For the same reason that this might be so scary on the first playthrough, you'll never really have anything new happen to you on a second. There weren't really any points where I felt like I had any unique interactions with the girl here that I couldn't have found on someone else's playthrough. When you know that these lights aren't going to go off, or that the girl's 100% going to show up at this door every time you walk up to it, it stops being scary and just becomes annoying. While I don't think it's necessarily a problem that 9 goes for the same roller coaster ride type encounters like 7, I can't help but feel like with 9 years in between, surely there was some way to find some kind of middle ground. Keep the first playthrough fear without feeling like a slog on replays. Maybe just a few more paths and a few less scripted scares to get stuck in. Luckily though, I think I can compliment the next Grace section for the exact opposite reason. I think among the areas in the RE Engine era games, the Road Hill Care Center might just be the most unique, feeling in some ways like the natural evolution of the RPD. It's actually shocking how many things seem to carry over between the two. Like the RPD, the only way to escape is by slotting in 3 collectible items scattered across the area. You also have this giant main hall that's sandwiched between a west and an east wing, both complete with second floors and a brief third level. Not to mention the weird little statue things that you need to find the codes of to access your discs or cubes. Ever since the original Spencer Mansion, Capcom's been using the same formula for all their main level designs. And honestly, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think a lot of the heavy lifting for making Requiem feel unique here is more in the enemies than the actual level design itself. The brand new zombies in Requiem have been changed to be more unique from one another, maintaining some of the behaviors or habits that they would have had pre-mortem. While maid zombies are obsessed with cleaning up blood splatters, butlers seem to be obsessed with removing any light sources, including light switches and even the glare off your own flashlight. With the recent RE Engine era games, or the games in general actually, there's never really been a case where stealth was your first preferred option. While 7 definitely had some, it was mostly limited to dealing with stalker enemies, with Molded needing you to run past or just straight up shoot them. With 8 and 4 Make they were action games, and the 2 and 3 Makes didn't give you a crouch button in the first place. For the most part, avoiding zombies in these games have always been kind of about juking them rather than actually hiding. With Requiem though, with a bigger focus on predictable enemy paths and habits, 9 is the first entry where you can actually reliably sneak past the majority of the game, something you'll more than likely do given how the game handles item management. More than almost all the other modern RE games, Grace's inventory space is probably the most limited it's been since the original, with inventory expansions being rare with even more essential items to bring along. One interesting change to the crafting system is the addition of the Blood Collector. In a standard Grace playthrough, this item will basically never leave your inventory. Blood buckets and pools replace what would be normal item pickups in the other games. The vast majority of your useful items are locked behind crafting with various amounts of blood. Requiem asks you to make pretty much everything with blood, including bullets, heals, and hemolytic injectors. That last one's pretty important. Although the game gives you a few to start with, Grace's only way to stealth kill is primarily locked behind the game's crafting system. And that's especially interesting when you take into account that the injectors are also one of the only ways to deal with Requiem's blister head mechanic. Calling back to the zombies in Spencer's Mansion, any body that's left alone for too long has the chance to mutate, coming back as stronger, much faster enemies. In Remake, the only way for Chris or Jill to get rid of them for good is to use the game's gasoline in lighter items. Limited resources that exist for the sole purpose of stopping Crimson Heads. This means that while you can't burn everybody, aside from the trip back to the item box, there's really no downside to not just doing it eventually. The choice is just in what bodies to burn. Grace's injectors though mostly come from crafting with blood. When you get rid of a potential blister head, you're not just choosing between which infected to get rid of, but you're also choosing to sacrifice a few potential bullets, healing items, or even damage upgrades. It's especially important if you play on Insanity mode, where most zombies take a dozen bullets and blister heads are practically guaranteed deaths. You'll notice by the end of your playthrough that depending on your own choices during the game, you'll have an excess of scrap, herbs, or bottles. Although you'll get access to a bunch of crafting recipes, you'll never have enough blood to do everything in the game. While you could use your scrap to make an injector to kill a zombie blocking a hallway, you could also use it to make yourself some bullets to stun it and run past instead. For me personally, all this made the care center one of, if not the most intense yet dynamic survival horror environments in the franchise. Going back and forth between the East and West Wings, I felt like I just had barely enough ammo and resources to make my way through each new enemy encounter. To beat the game, it's practically essential for you to sneak past or run past some of the game's zombies, doubly so in the early game and quadruply so on Insanity. I did notice though that while Requiem did a good job with its interconnected design, it left quite a lot to be desired on the puzzle front. Since its release, I've heard a lot of mixed opinions about this aspect. Some say they're just less obvious, and others say the game's puzzles are the zombies. But I think it says a lot that the first mandatory puzzle you find has its clue hidden not 5 feet away in the same room, to which the solution is also 5 feet away the next room over. The biggest problem isn't that there aren't enough puzzles, but the ones that are there don't really feel like them. For most puzzles, there's not really anything to figure out other than finding the relevant file. While I'm not saying that the game should bring back the full-on mini-games or shadow puzzles from the others, I do think it's a bit surprising to see the game have as few as it does. Overall, it's not necessarily a problem with the game, but it is reflective of a change in design philosophy. That's especially the case for the last puzzle, which isn't really a puzzle at all. After Grace makes her way through to the security office, she discovers that even though she has the combination, she can't read the dials on the box because they're in Braille, giving us one more task to do before getting our hands on the final quartz. Though I do wonder, how come Grace, a fully trained FBI agent, didn't just think of pressing the buttons to see which symbols popped up for each? I'll chalk it up to fear. Instead, Grace decides to take the blind girl, Emily, from the other side of the care center over to the isolation ward. This gives us a short section where we don't have access to any of our weapons, let alone our knees to crouch. Eventually though, after a brief holdout section, Emily finally gets you the third quartz cube, only for the stalker from the initial horror section to come back and drag her into the basement. But before we get to that, we have another Leon section, arguably one of the best, but also the biggest missed opportunity in the game. As you're first exploring the care center as Grace, you'll likely come across several warped doors and cupboards, objects that are otherwise uninteractable until you come back through as Leon, who can open them for loot with his axe. What I found more interesting though was getting to tackle the non-Leon exclusive stuff. If you take the time to re-explore Rhodes Hill, you'll find that any zombie bodies you left behind, as Grace, will be right where you left them. Same thing with any items. While the office fight is pretty fun, I'd say it's even more satisfying to hunt down and get revenge on all of the enemies that annoyed you earlier as Grace. Whether it's the zombies at the bar or the chef, it's pretty cool being able to blast and chop apart the enemies you otherwise had to sneak by just a little while ago. This also plays back into when you come back here as Grace later on, where you get the chance to soak up and craft with all the blood that Leon probably left behind on his massacre. It's a little sad to me that this is pretty much the only time the game really takes advantage of having two protagonists. I feel like there was a real missed opportunity here to really play off the shared resources and space angle. With both characters sharing resources, it would give all the more incentive to play aggressively as Leon and stealthily as Grace. But, the game is out now. Maybe in 10, huh? Getting back to Grace, if the girl is Ari's scariest stalker enemy, it follows that the basement might be Ari's scariest set piece yet. Maybe. Like the upstairs hospital, to free Emily and escape, the game asks you to find 3 key items, only this time, each key item is a battery, forcing you to decide which lights you want to keep on, and more importantly, which ones you're willing to leave off. With the 3 batteries scattered behind various locked doors, progressing looks like a back and forth puzzle where getting one battery means removing and rearranging the others. Admittedly, while it's not particularly hard to figure out that the doors with 1 battery slot should probably be dealt with before the door with 2, it feels like a lot bigger of an achievement when the process involves you fighting every instinct telling you to just stay in the light instead. This section of the game is definitely meant to be a more on rails type section. While the enemies certainly do have some nuance to them, of course you can still expect a pickup of any key items to prompt a quick visit from the girl. I have mixed feelings about this area. While I don't exactly hate it, in all of my subsequent playthroughs I don't think I've ever actually looked forward to it either. The zombies down here don't really follow the cool patterns that the ones upstairs do. They just kind of block your paths. And while the girl is cool the first time around, she also feels a bit too scripted. I think the plugs are really well thought out though, because while the light practically guarantees your safety, it makes it all the more jarring when you have to turn one off to walk into the dark. There's also a pretty cool section I liked where the developers decided to give Grace a more action-focused set piece, throwing you into a conveyor belt with a bunch of zombies. You can even kick them into the shredder. I'd say that while I enjoyed this area as the scariest part of the game, I think objectively it's probably just an okay section. It's a bit reliant on scripted encounters, but the premise and resource management are generally compelling enough to make up for it. After escaping with Emily, the game also pulls what I found to be a quite convincing fake out with the elevator crashing down. It's a pretty well done scene, and I genuinely believed for a second that Grace lost her leg, and that she was going to be out of commission for the rest of the game, leaving Leon to take over. Which, to be honest, isn't entirely untrue. Instead, we get a pretty heartwarming scene with Emily, where Grace resolves to rescue her, taking them both outside the care center after using the final quartz. What follows is a brief section in which Grace goes looking for some helicopter keys to escape the care center. I think it's at this point that I'd say the survival horror part of this game is gone. Picking up the pace significantly, Requiem really steps back from the slow-paced resource management and gives Grace the tools to absolutely melt through the zombies here. Literally. It's pretty cool, but it's not particularly engaging. We get the series standard escape from the collapsing facility sequence here, before in another series standard something goes wrong with the aircraft, sending them all crashing into a building. This leads straight into another action set piece, but now with Leon. Of all the Leon sections so far, I think this is probably the most inspired. After the crash, the game gives us a sniper to cover Grace's escape from the aftermath. It's alright, but the gameplay really takes a step up when Leon follows after Grace into the nearby church. I think Leon's new combat system really excels in these types of claustrophobic environments. With a big blisterborne enemy type turning any nearby dead zombies into blisterheads, Leon's axe and environmental stomp takedowns actually feel pretty essential to manage the enemy spawns here. Generally speaking, it just works. These types of small environments are perfect, and it would be a shame, just a shame, if they decided not to do that for the rest of the game. Unfortunately though, it doesn't last long, with Grace escaping down into the basement, which, of course, leads into yet another giant underground facility, where the girl has made yet another reappearance. Showing some pretty good development from the game's start, although she's still clearly afraid, Grace is also pretty resolute in dealing with the monster for the sake of protecting an injured Emily. Like the last girl area, it's not bad, but nothing to look forward to. It's a pretty straightforward encounter where, you guessed it, you have to activate 3 key switches to get the main door open. By the time Grace manages to get it open though, Emily's already succumbed to her wounds from the crash. A pretty tragic turning point that only gets worse when she mutates into a monster that Leon has to put down.
I wanted to save her!
You don't understand.
No, I never would have escaped without her! This is all my fault! Again!
As Grace walks off aimlessly, she runs into Victor, who offers her the choice to join him in finding Elpis. The weirdest part of the scene though is when Victor introduces us to the partner he's been working with this whole time. A fucking clone of Wesker. Of all the things Requiem's plot does, both the good and the bad, I think this one single scene is the thing that drags it down the most. While it's never been unknown for an RE game to kick up the ridiculousness towards its back half, it doesn't mean we can't criticize when it does happen. Like, something bad might happen a lot, but what if it just didn't? Even though dodgy writing might not be the end of the world, that doesn't mean we have to be fine with it. For one, why does Grace just instantly decide to tag along with Gideon? I know she's feeling guilty over Emily, but why would she instantly relax around the guy who basically got her killed? And for that matter, why didn't Leon at least attempt to stop Grace here? There's a little bit where he coughs up a bit of blood, but in the time it takes for him to recover, Grace is still only just walking away. They're only like one room or two apart. Most heinously though, I have to ask, why is Zeno here? I might be getting ahead of myself, but for the rest of the game after this point, Zeno doesn't do a single thing the writers couldn't have had Gideon do instead. Aside from being a clone of Wesker, he doesn't really contribute anything to the narrative other than just being in it. To me, it feels like fan service for fan service's sake, and it just waters down the plot. But, you know, life goes on. In the marketing leading up to the game's release, the return to Raccoon City predated the announcement of Leon itself. And honestly, for how much they pushed it in the marketing, I think it honestly feels like a bit of a letdown. Before taking us to some more familiar locales, Leon first needs to get through some of the city's burnt out streets, which, funnily enough, gives us more of Raccoon City to look through than the Remake ever did. Though, maybe a bit too much. With the way into the central city being blocked off by a gate, we first have to explore and collect pieces of a detonator to make our way through. I don't know what it is with the number 3, but Capcom really seems to have developed an obsession here. Like the care center or the basement, once again, to open up the way out, the game wants you to look around and collect 3 key items scattered around the area. Though this time, because you're doing it as Leon, things have been scaled up significantly. While Grace might have needed to sneak past a room to get some corrosives, Leon needs to win a chainsaw battle in a burning gas station to get his hands on some petrol. That's pretty accurate to real life now, actually. I have to say, I think Leon's gameplay works best in a more linear form of game design. Leading up to this point, the action palette cleansers that broke up Grace's sections might have been a little jarring, but they were generally quite well paced, as short but sweet combat encounters. That's not to say that extended periods with this type of combat doesn't work. In fact, when done right, it's quite the opposite. The problem here though is that it isn't done right. Instead of combat encounters broken up by exploration, it feels like exploration broken up by combat. I don't know about you guys, but for a character like Leon, the main selling point to me is combat. The loop that drives the gameplay is getting to fight zombies, so exploring is fun because it's the way we get to those fights. And we have some good ones here. The skyscraper segment sees us thrown into a collapsed building, where zombies can have their footing shut out beneath them. Another section sees you fighting on a descending platform. With the enemies closing in on Leon so quickly, it felt pretty cool playing on the defensive. The parry is just as awesome, if not awesomer, than it was in 4. Between these sections though, the city streets feel like they extend for a few blocks too many. The game tries to remedy this with a few enemies and loot crates spread out here and there, but it's not enough. While the combat really shines in big enemy encounters, I'd say it's almost more of a detriment in these exploration sections. Because Leon can so easily deal with any individual enemy, throwing a zombie onto the street really doesn't make it feel any less unengaging walking down it. When you can one-hit a zombie with the axe, running down a long street with an enemy is basically the same as running down any other empty street. It feels like you're just waiting to get past some filler. I'd also say it doesn't help how much inventory space Leon has. I can think of maybe one time that I ran out of space with Leon, and in that situation all I had to do was combine a few items. That was it. I got my space back. I know not everyone cares about this, but I find it a lot less exciting to find any items when I don't have to consider anything about whether or not I can actually afford to pick it up. The interesting thing though is that this exact kind of level design is present in the earlier stretch of the care center, and it actually works there because it suits Grace's gameplay. Finding a random piece of scrap feels like an accomplishment, knowing that taking it means you might have to leave something else behind. It's also helpful that when you're exploring as Grace, longer moments of walking are made engaging by the atmosphere. Since sneaking past or killing a zombie is always such an ordeal, The idea of actually running into one makes the empty hallways feel interesting to go through, even if you don't actually see any. When you're playing as Leon in this Raccoon City area though, even if you do see one, you might as well not have. I think they could have made this area a lot better by shrinking it down just a tad. The actual arenas are good, but there's just way too much walking around between them. While I wouldn't go as far to say this section is outright bad, it's definitely a misstep that causes some otherwise good action sections to feel more than a little dragged out. After Leon has gathered all 3 of the detonator parts though, the next part of the game logically follows as a motorcycle chase sequence. Being directed by the same guy who advocated so strongly for the regrounding of the series in 7, it feels a little out of character to include a section taken straight out of Metal Gear Rising. And out of character really is the key phrase here. I don't know who suggested this idea to the team, but throwing Gideon onto a motorcycle and having him and Leon joust with pistols felt kind of funny. Ironically, it feels like a very Resident Evil thing to include things that don't feel like Resident Evil. Kinda like the giant robot in 4 or the crocodile chase in 2 make. It's just par for the course for these games to randomly throw in something to tune up the camp. With this motorcycle section, I actually think it's quite funny, but I also have quite a few complaints about how it basically just removes Gideon from the rest of the plot. I'll save that one for later though, cause hopping off the bike leads straight into the long-awaited return to the RPD. The game really picks up the pace from this point. While the city outskirts felt like they went on for far too long, I had the opposite problem here. Again, Leon's dramatic return to the RPD was something the trailers really built up, which makes it all the more surprising how little time we actually get to spend there. I get that we already have 2 other games focused on the RPD, but I expected that at the very least we'd get some kind of reimagining of the place. Most of the RPD is blocked with debris, leaving only a few rooms available to go through in a relatively linear 5-minute path. My problem is that this whole return to the RPD feels more like a museum of artifacts than an actual return. The game very clearly wants you to soak up the atmosphere. You don't really have much to do here gameplay-wise other than just pick up the items to open up the gate. The whole time you're doing that though, you'll be walking past half a dozen nods to 2 make. All the while, the original soundtrack is begging you to say, oh wow, it's that thing from before. I did think it was a nice touch though that the jack to open up the gates is still up in the library where Leon left it in 2. But that's all it is. A nice touch. With how much Leon's changed in the last 30 years, I think it would have been a good chance to show how much he's grown. It could have been really cool to play through some of the similar enemy encounters from 2, but now with a much more experienced version of Leon. Kinda like the 4th Survivor game mode on steroids. By my count, there were only 2 zombies in the whole RPD here, with most sections being empty. Imagine if, instead, when we returned to an area like the library, we got the chance to fight a whole horde here. Turn what was previously a test of Leon's survival skills into an arena for him to show what he's learned since then. He could even have a one-liner like, should have called in sick again. Though I think that's been retconned. Instead, the RPD is just Leon grimacing at things for 10 minutes, and then it's just over. C'est la vie. After making his way to Grace and Zeno, we get a few more hints as to the villain's evil master plan. Grace might be the key to unlocking Oswald Spencer's final virus, something Zeno and Gideon have tracked to yet another underground Umbrella facility. To illustrate the point, we get yet another section that feels misplaced. In a blend of homage and asset reusage, we get to play as a kid hiding from enemies in the Raccoon City orphanage. There's not really any gameplay or systems of note here, it's just 15 to 20 minutes of waiting under furniture and watching unskippable cutscenes until it just eventually ends. It basically exists to tell us Spencer was experimenting on kids, and those kids look a lot like Emily and Grace. I don't know why Capcom keeps putting these sections in their titles. It's not just boring, but it takes away the whole flow of the actual gameplay. So, like how I wish I could with this section, I'm gonna spare you the suffering and just skip over the rest of it. Getting back to Leon and Grace, Leon has a brief exchange with Zeno before Mr. X drops in to fight him. There's a brief escape section here before leading on to a full-on boss fight. I've seen a lot of mixed opinions on Mr. X's inclusion here. While I agree it does feel like yet another case of nostalgia bait, I don't really mind it for the same reason I do mind the rest of the RPD section. It's pretty cool to get the chance to parry and trade blows with a dude who basically terrorized us in 2. No RPG needed this time, just an axe. Though, I wouldn't have minded an appearance from Ada. On the topic of boss fights though, leading up to this point, we've had 4 proper boss fights with 1 soon to follow. While I think they've been all more or less fine mechanically, that's more a testament to how good the combat is rather than the game's design. While the girl was a send-off to a long-term stalker, Chunk, the Spider, Mr. X, and Plant 43 more or less just kinda show up out of nowhere. While this game actually has quite a number of bosses, none of them really feel memorable, with Capcom electing to just completely forego any setup for them. Leon just runs into Chunk in the attic, and in the Spider and Plant 43's case, you get maybe about 5 minutes of set dressing to clue you in. In most cases, beating these bosses doesn't really feel like they contribute anything to the narrative. We're not dealing with a big bad like Salazar in his castle or Wesker in that random volcano, but just some creature or some guy standing in the way. It's hard to feel like the cool culmination of something when there's next to nothing to culminate. And so lies one of this game's biggest issues. Leon finally makes it to Ark, another sterile white facility for a final area. One interesting choice that I think Capcom made here was the use of non-BOW enemies. Most of them only take a few shots to the head to kill, but also, since they have guns, it's not too far off the mark for them to shoot you back. It's pretty neat on standard, but on sanity I found this encounter to be insane. Like 5 and 6, despite being on a completely different engine, the game's still clearly not designed for cover shooter gameplay. And then comes the boss fight everyone's been talking about.
Backup is on the way.
Not necessary. I'll neutralize the target myself.
Third in a row of bosses calling back to previous games, the commander gives us a Krauser-style mini-fight. There's been quite a lot of contention online as to whether or not this actually is Hunk, but all I have to say to that is, yes, it is. But it probably doesn't matter. Although he's missing the helmet, he sounds like Hunk, fights like Hunk, and looks like Hunk. If it is or isn't Hunk, at this point it really doesn't matter. Either way, if Capcom feels inclined to bring it back later, which they probably will, they're gonna find an excuse. Whether it's a clone or he miraculously survived Leon's axe, this 70-something-year-old man is coming back until Capcom accidentally leaks the real-life T-virus. Same with Leon. Even though he's been infected up until this point, I don't think anyone really thought Capcom was gonna kill off their main moneymaker. Don't say it, I'll get to it. As Leon finally makes it to Grace, to stop Xeno from getting his hands on Elpis and from giving us another cool boss fight, Leon takes Grace and tries to escape deeper into the facility. A few more bad coughs and it's back to Grace. I actually quite like Grace's little section in Ark. It comes with its own problems, but generally it's a fair attempt to bring back the tone left behind in the care center. Especially since the game gets a little bold here with its design. Instead of 3 key items to open a door, now Capcom wants us to find 2 to open a door. Inspired. Additionally, this section brings back the liquor enemy type. I thought it made for some pretty intense sections of sneaking, but we get just a few too many resources to make them all that threatening. The game gives us these acid bottles which one-shot any liquors they're thrown at, even on insanity. If it were just the ones we could pick up, it'd be one thing, but with each enemy here giving us around 40 blood, at this point you're free to basically make as many as you want. You can kill more, to craft more, to kill more, to craft more, to kill. I don't know if they balance the numbers this way intentionally, but on both my standard playthroughs, I found myself with arguably way too many resources here. On playthroughs with fewer resources though, like on Insanity, it can be a pretty fun balancing act between spending and getting your blood back. After getting the 2 orbs, Grace makes her way towards the main office section, where she finds a video of her mother Alyssa interviewing Oswald Spencer. But before we get the full context though, the game cuts away and sends us back to Leon, effectively for the rest of the game. By this point, Leon's T-virus infection has spread to most of his body. At various points, Leon starts stumbling and coughing as the screen gets this lumbago filter over it. It's yet another Metal Gear Rising feeling inclusion in this game. though this one feels a bit more appropriate. Just a little touch to make things feel a little more tense before the game's swan song. Speaking of, back with Grace, we get the rest of that Spencer interview from before.
Request for an interview. Who is that? Is that one of your subjects?
Of course not. She was alone in the world. I took her in to make amends.
Is she...
Perfectly normal. Just an average child needing a home. She is my hope.
I think the twist that Grace was never actually the key to anything was actually pretty good. The problem that I and a lot of other people have, though, is that Oswald Spencer is not the kind of guy to have a change of heart. At least from the original releases. Capcom's really gone down the route of retconning with the remakes. Every flashback Leon has in this game is from 2-make, not the original, and the fact that he even has so much PTSD is more of a remake thing than anything from the original. But avoiding a whole tangent here, what I'm basically getting to is that while Spencer probably wouldn't have done this, in the inevitable 5 remake they'll probably retcon it so that it seems more plausible. Don't know how I feel about that, but something tells me Capcom doesn't really care. Grace was Spencer's kid, then Alyssa's, and Spencer wanted atonement. That's what the game is trying to get across. Sure. So, after finding Leon barely clinging to life, Zeno asks Grace to put in the password to Elpis. We get 2 options here, but like with 7's cure choice, one is clearly the intended ending. Either get the ending where everyone lives, or get the ending where Grace literally says she wishes you went with the other ending. So, going with releasing Elpis, Grace types in the password HOPE, Zeno gets his hand on the virus, and injects it straight into himself without question. You know, in a universe where needles can range from turning you to a giant fish or straight up blowing you up, you'd really think he'd wait. But he doesn't. Then he dies. Why was he here again? On the bright side, Gideon comes back. Thankfully, he didn't die in that motorcycle chase, but it's also a bit too late to do anything particularly interesting with him now. After Grace gives Leon the cure and takes a back seat, it's now up to him to deal with Gideon once and for all. Again, to be honest, I was really hoping for some kind of 2-stage boss fight here, which we do get, but in a pretty uninspired way. I hate to bring this up again, but like a lot of the other bosses in this game, Gideon just felt a little underwhelming. While Requiem's intro sets up Gideon as the game's big bad, until quite literally right here in the last act, he's pretty much absent for the entire rest of the game. He kidnaps Grace, then disappears. He kidnaps Leon, and then disappears. Then he shows up to yell at Grace, disappears, and then races Leon, and disappears. Maybe if Gideon were actually around more than a few cutscenes here and there, it'd feel more impactful to actually see him show up for the fight. On the other hand too, it feels a little off that we're only fighting him as Leon. He was just as much a villain to Grace as Leon in this game. Arguably more so with the earlier reveal that he was the one who got Alyssa killed back at the hotel. Why not give Grace her own chance at revenge? In my first playthrough, I thought we'd get some kind of back and forth fight here. Maybe while Leon fights Gideon directly, Grace could be setting up the chance to hit Gideon with a railgun, or maybe even a dose of Elpis. In a cool twist of fate, we could have even had a moment where Leon takes on Ada's role, passing over a rocket launcher for Grace to finish the job. I get that action and combat is more of a Leon thing, but that doesn't mean he needed to get all the fun. Ethan was still allowed to have his fights in 7, why put Grace in detention here? But time's arrow marches forward. Leon easily beats Gideon, and we're left with this pretty touching scene. Thinking that there's no way out, Leon and Grace take a moment just to sit together as the last bit of power in the facility cuts out.
I'm gonna sit right here with you.
Then come Chris's guys from 8 to save the day. Who knows where Chris himself is though? Guess we'll find out in 10. Both Leon and Grace are completely fine, and now with Elpis, so is Sherry, and even Emily apparently. In the post-credits we actually get to see this, with a much more confident Grace talking to Leon on the phone about Sherry's recovery and Emily's new life as Grace's adopted daughter. Seems a bit happy, but sure. It's a good but little weird ending to a good but also weird feeling game. In the end, my first playthrough took about 10 hours to beat, though I've seen some people say shorter. As far as Resident Evil games go, it's probably somewhere around the middle in length, and honestly, as much as it pains me to say, I think it's also probably where it belongs in my ranking of the mainline games. It's a good experience all around, I'd even say a great one early on in the care center, but I also feel like it doesn't really manage to keep up that quality, let alone come close to it again after. With every other game in the franchise, it's not really a secret that Capcom likes to front-load these things. After the mansion, the laboratory is kinda disappointing. After the RPD, the lab is kinda disappointing. But after the care center, the whole game is kinda disappointing. With 4 and 7 being my favorite 2 games respectively, I was interested to see how Capcom could try mixing and interweaving the both. Evidently, they just kinda didn't. I don't know about you guys, but while I really enjoyed Requiem, I can't help but feel like I would have just preferred it if Capcom went with one or the other. While you could chalk up the drop in quality to the typical RE games just have weaker back halves, I think it's actually a bit more complicated this time. It's not that the Raccoon City section is just worse, but more specifically, it's effectively a different game. Not necessarily a bad game, but a different game nonetheless. Where 9 goes wrong isn't just that it's front-loaded, but more specifically, the start of the game is the only time Capcom feels willing to commit to anything. Before I go on, I'll admit that Capcom was in a bit of a precarious situation here. With so many changes throughout development, making a game like Requiem is already quite an achievement by itself. I could see why they might have gone down the route they did, and while the issues that came with it might not be all that big a deal, it doesn't mean it's not worth critiquing. Now, with that said, I, a completely unqualified rando, am going to talk about how much a few little things most people probably don't care about have been bothering me for the last month now. Let's start with the game's most glaring problem. I've already mentioned that I think one of the biggest issues I have with Requiem is how it deals with its 2 protagonists, which is interesting because that's actually nothing new to the franchise. Since the very first game, the idea of playing different characters has always been around, and I think pretty much every game since then has given some kind of way to play as multiple characters. Even when these games don't give us the explicit choice between different routes, Capcom always throws in at least a handful of switching to a temporary character sections. While I enjoy having different routes and really enjoy playing in co-op, I don't think there's ever been a time in a Resident Evil game where I've particularly liked the whole switching characters thing. And I'd assume that goes for most people. I don't know what the design intention is, but I feel like these sections only ever seem to range from complete pace killers to just kinda passable. I can't help but sigh and roll my eyes every time I get into one of these games, only to be stopped and thrown into a castle as Ashley or orphanage as a child. Again, it's weird it happened twice. The thing is though, I think Capcom actually did a pretty good job at blending the 2 campaigns. It easily could have turned out horribly, but they kept the 2 from stepping too much on each other's feet. Instead of a constant back and forth, Leon and Grace still mostly have their own parts of the game, where the other character just serves to break up their bigger areas. While I'd say that choice was generally pretty good at keeping the tone consistent, I'd also say it was also too good at keeping the campaigns separate. As one of the core pillars of Resident Evil, these games are at their best when you're dealing with resource management. Whether it's deciding what to carry in your inventory or how best to use your limited ammo, every choice feels like it matters because anything you use in one moment means you won't be able to use it in the next. In character switching sections, all that goes out the window. Whatever we pick up here doesn't really matter, and whatever we've saved before, we don't need to worry about. It's hard to get invested when there's quite literally nothing to invest in. Requiem marks the first time that a single campaign is evenly split between 2 characters. Not 2 characters running mirrors of the same campaign, but just one campaign. Again, I think in isolation both Leon and Grace's campaigns are fine, but they fall short of great. By the time I found myself really enjoying Grace's section, the game had swapped over nearly full time to Leon. Everything I gathered up as Grace, all the resources and items, pretty much stopped mattering here. Although these two campaigns should be two halves of the same game, because Leon has a separate inventory with different mechanics, that's kind of impossible. It's kinda like starting an entirely different game at the halfway point, cause it is. As Leon in Raccoon City, you don't play anything like you would've as Grace. Instead of sneaking around and scavenging for resources, now it's an action game where you're killing everything to upgrade your gear with points. But what makes it jarring isn't the fact that the gameplay is switched up, but that the game refuses to acknowledge it. While Leon playing differently as Grace isn't an issue, the fact that nothing you did as Grace earlier has any effect on what you do as Leon is a problem. In most RE games, there's a sense of progression and getting stronger because you picked up a new item. While 7 came with its own problems, it's still a cohesive experience. Moving from pistols to shotguns, the change feels satisfying because Ethan's still playing by the same rules. Every upgrade adds to his existing loadout and changes the gameplay loop. You can tell you're reaching the end of the game because you're so much stronger than when you started. People say that Requiem is too short, but it's about the same length as most other RE games. What I think people mean to say is that it feels too short. Both Leon and Grace only get half a game each. Not two halves of the same game, but two games that share the same story. And that's really clear in the sense of progression, where it feels like it just kinda cuts off halfway. Why does Grace only get access to 3 guns throughout the whole of runtime? And why is Leon asleep for half of the campaign? All good questions that could be answered by saying, Capcom's clearly still afraid of commitment. Wanting to stick with the direction they went with in 7, but also wanting to bring back fans coming off of 4 Remake, it's like they wanted to make both even though they were given the time and budget of 1. The end product is basically just a watered down version of both. It's like 7 if it ended after the main house, but it's also like 4 if you only got to play the island. The sad thing is though, I think if they picked one direction, it could have been an evolution of either. As I mentioned before, the new zombie behaviors gave some of the best designed horror sections I've ever seen. Alongside the blood injector, I think we could have had the best survival horror in the franchise. On the other hand, I also felt like Leon's combat was some of the best in the series. With the addition of the axe and throwable items, if they gave us just a few more cabin sequences and a few less empty streets, I think it could have topped 4 if Capcom was willing to lend the runtime. I mentioned earlier in this video the idea of having Leon and Grace share more sections, and I really stand by it. If the biggest issue is that the progression loop feels a little too short, the easy solution is to make it just a little bit longer. Give a bit more time for Grace to power up, and give Leon a few more chances to throw hands with his axe. It also helped with the glaring narrative issue of Grace basically just disappearing in the back half of the game. For the last 4 or so hours of runtime while Leon's going around Raccoon City, presumably Grace is just off with Zeno shooting the shit about something. It's a pretty big period of time that never really gets addressed in the story. Zeno seems like he's convinced her that she's the key to something important, but we don't really get to see what that looks like for Grace. One moment she's convinced to come along, the next she's freaking out, and then she's just escaping with Leon. We don't really get the time to unpack anything. Most of her character arc presumably happens off-screen. So, as a random guy on the internet without any game design experience, here's my suggestion to fix all of these problems. My Elpis to the T-virus, if you will. Take it with a grain of salt. As entertaining as I thought it was, let's imagine Capcom took out the budget put into the motorbike scene and doubled down on the RPD. Leon's still riding over, but now there's no chase scene, giving us the perfect excuse to have another section with Grace. And now that Gideon's free, he can be the one with Grace instead of Zeno, so this time, when Grace sees the orphanage footage, preferably as a cutscene, she can put 2 and 2 together, realizing that Gideon basically killed her mother as he's standing right next to her. That way, instead of passing out, Grace now has the chance to lash out a bit, reaching for the Requiem before realizing she gave it back to Leon. Now we're stuck in the RPD with Gideon looking to grab us to bring us to Ark. I imagine this as another care center-like section, only this time we're trying to reuse the same exit Leon and Claire did in 2. All the while, Gideon's roaming the halls. Grace could get the chance for a bit more progression over here, grab a few guns left behind in the police station to make her progression feel more complete. One idea could even be a leftover samurai edge forgotten in the STARS office. This way, the game might feel a little bit more filled out. Grace gets to show some development, we can build up more to the later Gideon fight, and most importantly, we get to feel some progression, letting the game feel like it approaches a more natural feeling end. As I mentioned before too, Leon can get here just as Grace is about to leave. Like the care center, Leon could have his own chance to look through the area, left with whatever resources Grace decided to leave behind to clear out the repurposed arenas. Maybe even a quick boss fight with Gideon. Again, I'm not a game dev, but I think it's a pretty feasible extension. With so many assets to reuse from 2 here, I feel like the budget they put into modeling and coding the motorbike section could have made this a pretty reasonable addition. I'd assume that's probably the same reason the devs were so keen on including the orphanage section here. It's basically a retread of the Sherry section from 2, but hey, they had the assets I guess, and I'd argue my idea is probably a better use of time. I'm sure there are quite a few things that I might be overlooking here, but generally speaking, I think the game was just missing one more Grace section and a few more Leon encounters. I don't think it'll perfectly resolve all the problems I brought up with this game, but without completely redesigning the concept from the ground up, I think it'd be the most straightforward approach. Maybe the DLCs could fix some of the other problems. I don't think they're going to change the existing game, but it'd be nice to see if any of these issues get addressed in what they add post-release. For the most part, I assume the upcoming DLCs are going to be more single character focused. I've heard rumored both an Alyssa and Leon focused expansion to come, and I think they could both be good. Some more context to flesh out what Alyssa was getting up to can make her abrupt death feel a little more interesting. Maybe a stronger link between Outbreak and the main series, that way the shared namesake can be something more than just a reference. On the other hand, I think a Leon focused DLC would just generally be a nice idea. Some more time to fully realize the new Leon combat in some proper arenas could be just the push it needs to match RE4's design. Not to mention, a bit of context to see what Leon's been up to during the Winters game could be interesting to see. Especially in the Ada department. With her appearance being planned and cancelled all the way back in Village, I think it's been a long time coming to finally get a new appearance from her. What I'd really like to see though in some DLC is something about the other Raccoon City survivors. What were they up to during all this? I'm assuming they were infected too, and if not, are we really to believe that Claire would have just ignored Sherry's condition? It could be a cool idea to get an expansion where we could see Jill, Claire, or even Ada off on their side quests trying to find a solution to the T-virus. It'd explain away a lot of the issues I have here. In a less serious sense, we've also seen the announcement of a new arcade-style DLC. I can only assume it's Mercenaries, and honestly I'd be surprised if it wasn't. I've heard some concerns though about how Grace would fit into the game mode, and the solution I've mostly heard is about adapting a raid-like mode from Revelations. Some modified campaign sections where we can upgrade stats to complete certain goals. Either way, while I'm sure they'll try to have fun with these, I think whatever we end up seeing in the DLCs will be a good indication for the next steps of the franchise. With how much could have gone wrong with this entry, I think Requiem is a game to be commended, but not to deify. Capcom has always had problems with trying to appeal to everyone. With the DMC Ninja Theory reboot, Capcom wanted to see a more punk rock energy to appeal to Western audiences. With RE6, Capcom wanted to try doing a little of everything, having an action campaign to capture Call of Duty fans while also having some light horror elements to hang on to their existing fanbase. In both cases, they failed. In the last few years though, Capcom has found itself coming back to its original strengths. Reviving the dead franchise, DMC5 was a surprising but welcome return to the series' campy roots. And while it wasn't for everyone, 7 stripped down all the novelties of 6 to bring the series back to its original survival horror premise. Following up with 8 and the remakes, Capcom defined their new era of games by their willingness to embrace what made their company in the first place. It goes without saying then that when I saw Capcom advertising a dual approach to action and horror, I was concerned. But now I can safely say Capcom didn't relapse, and I hope it stays that way. With the clear design intentions between both campaigns, I think they've shown a good understanding of what makes both a survival horror and action horror experience tick. What remains to be shown though is whether or not they learn how to make them really work together, not just coexist. I'm really interested to see if Capcom sticks with this approach in 10. While I'm sure we're going to get at least 1 or 2 remakes in between, there's a lot less certainty for where the next mainline release might go. One option could be a fully focused Grace game, which I think I'd be happy to see. Taking on a similar role to Ethan, I'd be more than interested to play as a more confident and experienced Grace. With how much she toughened up across 9, it'd be awesome to take on a more capable but still survival horror experience. If Capcom decides to leave the girl alone though, I could see Chris returning off the back of a potential RE5 remake. Leon got the time of the spotlight with the recent remakes, and while Chris showed up in 7 and 8, I wouldn't be mad at seeing him move out of the supporting role back into another boulder punching experience. Of course though, the answer could also be somewhere in between. Like we've gotten just now, a dual protagonist approach could definitely be something to look forward to, especially if they work on a stronger sense of progression. Regardless though, I think with the current reception 9 has gotten as the now best-selling and even in some cases best-rated RE game, Capcom really can't go wrong. And while I share in a lot of the hype for how good this game is, I think it's important to hold them accountable for the problems that they have shown. To put it simply, Requiem is a fantastic entry in the series, but it could be better, and we should all remember that. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you have a good day.